Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. My name is Tom Ricks, and I am hosting today, as I do pretty much every day, unless it's Rhombus Tix or EP Blingemeyer or one of my other personas. For the last 6 podcasts, I have done something very different for this podcast, which is normally about my writing or whatever random thing I want to do, and talked about the Mormon Church. In part because I spent the first 35 years of my life as a member of the Mormon Church, and in part because, quite frankly, it's my podcast and I can do whatever I want with it, and I am now past the point where I'm concerned about branding or image, and as I mentioned in the first of these, I'm now past a point where I am worried about offending certain family members about what I say about the LDS Church, given their behavior when I was threatened with a lawsuit by one of my family members. But I would like to think that the few members of the family who are Mormon, whose opinion I do care about, will concede that I've at least tried to be fair about this. But ultimately, this is my statement, and I have tried to be fair about this. So the fact is that the penultimate of the questions I want to ask is, what can be done to fix this inside of the church? The last will be what pressures can be brought to bear outside of the church to try and fix things. I want to be clear that in making this, I'm under no illusions that I will ever cause the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to cease to be. It's not going to happen. Religions are too resilient, and even if circumstances far beyond myself cause the church to drastically reduce in numbers, there will always be, in my opinion, someone following at least the precepts of Joseph Smith long after everyone on this planet is dead. Or at least everyone living on this planet. And for all I know, a bunch of sentient raccoons might find a copy of the Book of Mormon 1 billion years from now and start doing the same thing. There are too many copies of the Book of Mormon. There are too many branches of the Mormon Church for me to believe that the teachings and beliefs of Joseph Smith will not have an influence on theocratic and theological discussions for, I would argue, millennia to come. A religion founded 100 years from now may have the teachings of Moses or Christ or Muhammad or Joseph Smith, or ignore Joseph Smith entirely and use the Book of Mormon, or possibly even more likely, some future version of the Bible may include the books of Moses and Abraham that Joseph Smith translated. So my point is in doing this is, like I said, it is not to attack the Mormon Church in the sense that I truly believe that this podcast is going to go out there and people will suddenly say, oh, I should not be Mormon. For some people, the teachings of Joseph Smith are a profoundly positive spiritual experience. And for some of those people, they also believe those teachings to be the teachings of Jesus Christ. I am not one of the people that says that the Mormons are not Christian. That is not true. I regularly, ultimately, and totally believe that the actual core doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a Christian doctrine. The very name of the church itself refers to Christ. But I also stand by my statement that a majority, I would argue a supermajority, of the active members of the LDS Church are so busy with the things that the church has them do that they have little to no time to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. And those two statements might seem contradictory, but they are not. And that is not the subject of this podcast. This particular podcast is going to be, if you are a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and if you have agreed with some or all or any of the things that I've talked in the other 6 podcasts, the un-Christ-like behavior of the supposed Church of Jesus Christ, the treatment of Native Americans by the Church of Jesus Christ, the treatment of women by the Church of Jesus Christ, the treatment of LGBT members by the Church of Jesus Christ, the blatant temptation that they have set up for apostate members to, quote, help, end quote, the church, either for conservative political reasons or to create a famine. If any of these things causes you concern, then you might think to yourself, well, if I am a faithful member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, what can I do to make my church better? And I'm going to tell you what I knew a long time ago when I started having trouble with the culture of the church, long before I had any trouble with the doctrine of the church and still genuinely believed it to be true. The answer is not a thing. The church is designed from the ground up to stifle dissent. I'm sorry, but it is. So the truth is that this podcast is both an attempt to explore that question and to also mount a 7th criticism. Because the fact is that on the surface of it, especially when he initially created it, Joseph Smith had a very open philosophy to prophecy and doctrine. Anyone could receive prophecy. Anyone could receive revelation. In fact, the core of what Mormons refer to as a testimony, or essentially the suite of their personal spiritual experiences as regards to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or their testimony of Christ. The core of that should start with a verse at the end of the Book of Mormon that says that if any of you want to believe in these words, pray to God, and you will receive a manifestation of the Spirit. I hadn't shared this until now, but I do want to be clear. Unlike most 8-year-old children in the church who are baptized at the age of 8, I was challenged by my bishop to pray about that verse, and did, in fact, receive a powerful spiritual revelation, for me personally, that the Book of Mormon is true. Now, how do I reconcile that with the fact that I no longer believe that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is true? Well, the fact of the matter is that I was 8 years old. And specifically what happened in this case is that I did read this verse, and I did ponder this verse, and I did pray about this verse, and I received an enormously powerful spiritual affirmation that it was true. But here's the thing. That can mean a lot of things. That can mean that there are truths in the Book of Mormon that should be listened to, which, by the way, is true. That could mean that the Book of Mormon is true, but that doesn't say anything by itself of Joseph Smith or anything about Brigham Young. Now, a Mormon missionary who is teaching this subject will argue that, if the church is true, then the Book of Mormon has to be true. Or if Joseph Smith is a prophet, then the Book of Mormon has to be true. But that's not actually really true at all, in the sense that there are many conceivable realities where you could have the Book of Mormon be true, which I do not believe it is, but I'm broad-minded enough to believe that in our reality, could a bunch of Israelites have built a boat, sailed across the ocean, and come to this country? Yes, absolutely. Now, would the archaeological evidence be undeniable if they had? Yes, absolutely. They would still be here. the children of Israel are a resilient culture, and they are still here. The one tribe we know about, Judah, is still here. They're everywhere. They have kept their traditions. So, and they write a lot. And so, and in the Book of Mormon, they keep records. They don't just keep the golden plates. They keep multiple plates and multiple written records. And so we would see Reformed Egyptian all over everywhere. In the Book of Mormon, supposedly, the Israelites were everywhere in North and South America. And while they interpret it to be a specific geographical landmass, if you read it as it is originally written, it's very heavily implied it's North and South America. At a minimum, it's definitely Central America if you draw a map as it's described. And the truth is that this Reformed Egyptian is nowhere. Now, like I said, I'm not doing these podcasts from the perspective of criticizing the mythology of the Mormon Church, but what I am saying is I'm open-minded enough to believe that it could be true. What I'm not open-minded enough to believe is that just because I got a positive spiritual impression, which I still believe that I experienced, I know what I felt, does that inherently mean that if there is some spiritual reality that God was telling me that I had to believe the church, even if the church was actually true? You have to build your testimony within the doctrine of the church. You have to build your testimony beyond that first spiritual experience. And I had a number of spiritual experiences, a number of affirmations. By the way, I did actually receive spiritual affirmation about Joseph Smith as well. So I'm readily willing to acknowledge the spiritual power and the many beneficial things that Joseph Smith said. But no, I am no longer willing to simply say that just because Joseph Smith said some good things and possibly enhanced the gospel of Christ by some of the things that he taught or thought about, that doesn't mean that he couldn't have fallen as a prophet. And more importantly, even if he didn't fall as a prophet, that doesn't mean anything about Brigham Young being a prophet. If you are a genuine, faithful Latter-day Saint, you need to maintain a testimony about the living prophet and every prophet that has occurred since Joseph Smith. You should pray about, study the readings of, and believe the teachings of every prophet from Joseph Smith, who received this supposed restored power, all the way to the current president of the church. And if you don't believe that, then you are not a faithful Latter-day Saint, period. You can believe whatever you want. I believe firmly that everyone has a right to their subjective spiritual experience, and we should all treat everyone's subjective spiritual experience as sacred. But just because you have one doesn't mean yours is better than anyone else, and it doesn't mean that you have a right to impose anything that is derived from that subjective spiritual experience on anyone else, except for the fact that it's your opinion. You are totally entitled to have your opinion, to believe your opinion, and share your opinion, but that opinion does not get to become law. Law has to be based on objective reality, objective opinion, and something that benefits everyone regardless of what they believe. So going back to my original question of how can you reform the church from within? There aren't a lot of ways. If you publicly criticize the church, first of all, you're very likely to be excommunicated, and if you're not excommunicated, at a minimum, your bishop's going to have a talk with you about it. And the truth is that because that's directly against the teachings of the church, repeatedly. Not only is it in every single Sunday school manual and every single book of scripture that's accepted by the church, in the Bible, in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, in the Doctrine and Covenants, in the Book of Mormon, in the Pearl of Great Price, in every single general conference they have, one of the most recurring themes is follow the prophet. In primary, they teach this to you. In Sunday school, they teach this to you. In Elders Quorum, they teach this to you. In the Visiting Teaching Manual, every year you get at least one lesson on following the authority of your leaders. In the temple, one of the oaths you take is no evil speaking of the Lord's anointed. And to be clear, whether or not you agree that this is LDS doctrine, anyone who is honest cannot deny that the way it is taught in the LDS Church is that disagreeing with the Lord's anointed is equal to speaking ill of the Lord's anointed. And just for those of you who are not Mormons, what the Lord's anointed refers to in this case is the leadership of the LDS Church. And broadly, the way that's interpreted is everyone from your local bishop/priest or your congregational leader all the way up to the prophet or the person who's in charge of the LDS Church. You are not to criticize the church in any way, in any shape, or in any form. And the truth of the matter is that even though I didn't bring this up, I take umbrage to the idea that the Church of Christ puts a higher priority on its public image than it does on following the precepts of Christ. I believe, and this is my personal belief, that Christ himself welcomed dissent because he himself was a dissenter. He was a speaker to truth. He spoke out against the hypocrisies that he saw in his day. He spoke out against the Pharisees and the Sadducees and also the Romans. He criticized those who engaged in behavior that was unchristlike, or since that word didn't exist at his time, engaged in behavior that was uncharitable or unkind or unloving. Christ was, in any narrative that you care to accept, whether a man or a Messiah, a divine figure, a rabbi, or a fictional character, in all of these, if you are being honest, you must concede that Christ was above all kind and loving and truthful. And so, if this is a truthful man and a caring man, how can you have a church that is supposedly built in his image that tolerates exactly zero dissent? Now, a faithful saint who is defending their church would say that of course there's room in the church for dissent, but there really isn't. Let me give you another example of how little room for dissent there is in the LDS Church. Go to a Mormon sacrament meeting, especially if you go on the first day of the month or the first Sunday of the month. When someone is called to a new calling or job in the church, the bishop gets up in front of the congregation and he says, "Good morning, brothers and sisters. I'd like to announce that Brother Smith has been called to be the leader of the Young Men's Association, or, the teacher of the elders, or scoutmaster, even though that's not a thing anymore, but whatever calling it may be, whatever job that they're given." And then he will say something along the lines of, "I'd like you to raise your hands and sustain him." And so what you'll do is you'll see that virtually every member of the church in the congregation will raise their right arm to the square, and that's it. Then they'll go on. Occasionally they'll do it for everybody, but usually they do it for, they'll announce a list of names and jobs and then go from there. Occasionally in more formal settings, like what they have something called ward conference, which I'm not going to get into, or the stake meetings, which is essentially the meeting of where multiple congregations meet together. They have even more formal rules about this. But this is the illusion of a vote without actually having a vote. They used to say those who are in favor and those who are against, but they've stopped doing that. And the reason they've stopped doing that is because if you put your hand up to the no, well, first of all, nothing ever happens. Nobody cares, except for your bishop is going to come over to you and say, "Excuse me, Brother Bob, we need to have a talk in my office." In the early 80s, Gordon B. Hinckley, who is one of the most monumentally influential prophets of the 20th century because of how long he lived and also because of how long he was first counselor in the first presidency, was responsible for the excommunication of a number of influential academics in the church who genuinely tried to reform things. My mother joined the church in the 1970s during the era of Spencer W. Kimball, who was one of the more open-minded Mormons, probably the most open-minded prophet that I'm aware of, certainly since Joseph Fielding Smith. And he was the one who was responsible for the revelation that African Americans could receive the priesthood. He was the one responsible for the revelation that those who were under the age of 8 were automatically innocent. It's heavily implied in the Book of Mormon, but a revelation was finally received that said, yes, children that die don't go to hell. I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer. Christ clearly loves children. Christ is not here to save children. They're innocent. And yet there were a number of people that felt that baptisms for the dead for a 2-year-old was necessary, as if the sacrifice of Christ would not protect a 2-year-old, much less an infant. In fact, in the Book of Mormon, it goes to great lengths to criticize infant baptism. And at some point, you know what? I'm not going to cover that in this podcast, even though it was influential in my leaving the church. I'd just like you to look up the terms baseball baptism and Henry B. Moyle. Henry B. Moyle was somebody engaged in baseball baptism, which is essentially infant baptism, and was a leader of the church and never excommunicated. But a bunch of academics who dared to criticize the church under the auspices of Ezra Taft Benson were excommunicated. And Gordon B. Hinckley, as you can read in Hierarchies of Power, was very influential in doing this. There was a magazine that was essentially responsible for a lot of conspiracy theories in the church called Sunstone. It's still around, but it has drastically been reined in by repeated calls from the leadership of the LDS Church, because they don't want any alternate or competing channels in the church about how revelation is received. Joseph Smith, going back to his original thinking, not to cover the mythology, but his actual beliefs, had great respect and reverence for his father, Joseph Smith Sr. And he actually created out of whole cloth a co-equal and equally important branch of the ecclesiastical leadership of the LDS Church called the Patriarch. Now, in the modern LDS Church, all the Patriarch does is basically he's theoretically in charge of each stake, which has their own Patriarch. And as I've said before, the Patriarch is basically responsible for a patriarchal blessing, which is essentially your own personal scripture/horoscope. But in the original architecture of the LDS Church, this office was meant to be a kind of a spiritual counterweight to the first presidency. Anybody who truly has a deep understanding of the doctrine of the LDS Church understands that, in theory, all of the keys are held by the Quorum of the 12. All of the keys are held by the first presidency and by all the 70. And so if a meteor came down and hit and killed every member of the first presidency and every member of the first Quorum of the 12, the 70 could still come together and basically rebuild or restart the church by all agreeing unanimously to have new apostles. So in addition to this, the patriarchy is considered to be co-equal. Quinn very successfully paints a picture of the early church being essentially a much more magical church, much more magical thinking in its nature. Miracles happened more, revelation was more free, and the kind of the mystical side of the church is definitely locked up into this office. But the other thing that this office did, and the reason it was removed, is because if the prophet, who in early days of Utah is both the governor and judge and jury and executioner and spiritual revelator, then power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And Joseph Smith himself realized that he wanted someone to tell him no. He wanted someone to tell him, Joseph, you should not do that. That is why he created/received revelation for the office of the Patriarch. And in theory, that can happen, but realistically, these days, that's never going to happen, because the office of the Patriarch has been reduced to a token office, almost as token as the presiding bishop. Now, the presiding bishop has lots of secular things. He's basically the guy in charge of all that land and all that food and all that money that the church has, which makes sense for a bishop. But what does the Patriarch do? What exactly does the Patriarch do now? Well, he's kind of in charge of your patriarchal blessings. and he trains and sets aside patriarchs. Okay, that's nice. If you read the way Joseph Smith talks about the patriarch and the office thereof in the early days of the church and how important it is, the fact that this office does nothing now makes you wonder, did the LDS Church actually receive the keys, or was that the Reformed Church, or even the founding? I would argue that in some ways the fundamentalists have closer to the teachings of Joseph Smith in some ways than the current LDS Church. But regardless of your arcane beliefs on orthodoxy in the LDS Church, the fact is that this office was created to offer an alternate viewpoint. And ironically, in LDS scripture, there is plenty of room to give women the priesthood. There is plenty of room to allow gays to marry. I know that sounds crazy, and your average Mormon is not going to allow it, but I assure you that at the height of my knowledge and belief in the LDS Church, right before I left, I could find a justification for it. There's sealed plates. There's revelation. There's the fact that women are temporarily allowed to perform priesthood ordinances in the temple. There's the fact that God, if God is a god and his wives are goddesses, they're freaking goddesses, right? They're not concubines. They're wives. They're supposed to be co-equal with God. Well, you can't be co-equal with God if you have no power. And if you have no voice, if women have no voice in the church, that's not co-equal. So the truth is that in the church, they could do anything they wanted if they really wanted to. But if you're a faithful member of the church, you are not given a way to do that. You could maybe try and find family members of apostles and try and convince them, and maybe they could convince the by friendly conversation, and maybe they could convince the apostles, and they could talk to the prophet. That's it. Or you could pray. If you believe in the power of prayer, you can pray into God that God will speak unto the current president of the LDS Church. But I got to tell you, I think that God, if he is talking to the president of the LDS Church, would have some things to say before he's going to talk about giving women the priesthood, like, stop supporting Donald Trump, or stop not saying anything until the last minute about kids in cages, or why are you allowing people to commit awful acts in my name to help my church to cause a famine? All kinds of things that I think Christ would have to say to the prophet of the LDS Church before he's going to talk about whatever your pet project is. But the fact of the matter is that my point still stands. The LDS Church is a church that stands for no dissent, that will not tolerate those who break its rules. Try me and see. If you want to be excommunicated, by all means, get up the next Fast and Testimony meeting and see exactly what happened to that woman who accused her bishop of being a rapist. I assure you, if she was still a member of the church, she isn't any longer.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, available in many markets, including at Amazon.com. Copyright 2018, Red Anvil Amalgamated, LLC.
To fight the forces of evil!